A monument can do many things.
The Latin phrase means to declare or to instruct.
They're meant to communicate who we are, what that means.
It can actually represent the values of a society.
A monument is supposed to instruct people in what's historically important,
As well as meant to create a ripple effect far beyond the exact place in which the monument is erected.
It's not just a piece of marble.
Monuments tie into particular broader national stories. You can think about monuments as a way of telling a particular kind of narrative, a particular kind of set of events where people can go visit, they can go engage with, they can learn about history, and they can see themselves as part and parcel of a particular set of historic experiences.
You can see it really starting with European empires, the state involvement in monumentalization. Prior to that, it was largely a religious endeavor, and monuments, such as they were, very often had religious connotations, and they were far more locally driven. With the rise of European empires, monuments became a way to make the state present as a way of anchoring that particular place and the people that live in that place as not only part of the empire, but those people then became subjects of the monarch.
In the 1870s in particular, around the Western world, monument building became a cottage industry, and it's really associated with the new rise of nation-states around the world. We started seeing the breakup of empires, but people were refashioning how they think about their governmental organizations. And one of the ways that people started to breed new identities then, and new political ideals, was through monuments.
That's why then a monument gets placed in public space, so that the residents of that city or those that pass by see this and they're prompted to think about certain things.
There's a sort of strange power to some monuments in that the way that people encounter monuments in time and space can be relatively spontaneous. People walk past them, reflect on them in the town square and so forth, not perhaps thinking about, well, there was this commission, this jury that decided to put up this particular monument and selected these designs, and it was funded by these agencies or corporations or the public. So people don't necessarily think about those questions. They just sort of interact with the finished product of that process. If they did, they might interpret what the monument is trying to tell them, have them remember in a very different way.
The difference between having them in a lived-in space and a museum is, I think, pretty vast, right? If they're in a museum, you can choose to see them or not see them. You can choose to go to that museum or not go to that museum. A public monument, I think, has a sense of solidity, a sense that it's a kind of permanent fixture.
In order for a society to function, there has to be a certain basis of commonality. There has to be a certain sense of shared values. And monuments are a symbolic statement of either a collective shared experience in the past or a collective sense of future aspirations. In the Soviet Union, they made extensive use of monuments literally in every Soviet city, town, and village. And this was meant to form the underpinnings of a Soviet identity in a country that otherwise embraced over 100 different nationalities and in a landmass that spanned 11 time zones. So the challenge of unifying this population was particularly intense. But one of the ways in which they accomplished that was through monumentalization in public space.
Anytime you memorialize something, you are calling attention to a particular aspect of that narrative. You're creating a particular kind of narrative arc. And in doing that, you are reducing people, you are reducing events to a set of digestible moments. And very often, those moments tie into broader questions of national identity, of national belonging, and of telling a particular kind of story at the expense of other stories, other events, other people. It's a reflection of those dominant narratives, that window into those broader processes, which gives monuments their power and which really speaks to how we can start to think complexly about what monuments mean and how monuments operate in broader society. Allowing people to tell stories and to memorialize those stories is a major part of transitional justice. The way in which communities can start to move forward to create a different set of engagements and to create a different set of stories around memorials and memory work. Political violence has been part and parcel of the American experience, and we don't really do a very good job of talking about it or remembering it. In geography, we talk a lot about memory work. Memory work is a political project in which you have citizens and you have different groups in communities engage in a broader project to understand the place of memorials, the place of memory, and in particular to really confront negative memories and legacies of violence in a community. We often think of those communities as being wounded in a particular kind of way. And those wounds have lasting effects and lasting legacies for people who live in that community. And so there's a lot of different ways that we can think about the place of violence in a community, what violence means, and what it means to tell a story around those events. In the late 70s, Greensboro was one of the centers of textile manufacture in the United States and certainly North Carolina. And there was a group of radical labor organizers, and they were radical, who were trying to unionize several of the textile mills in that city. The Ku Klux Klan is an obvious racist organization in the American South, but they also have a long history of fighting unionization. The labor organizers in Greensboro knew this, and so they had a series of rallies trying to draw attention to the Klan. And so in Greensboro, North Carolina, on November 3rd, 1979, these labor organizers had a rally, and unfortunately they titled it a Death to the Klan rally. The Klan showed up, there was an armed confrontation. 5 people were killed, at least 9 others were wounded. After 2 state trials, none of the Klan found guilty of murder.
The state protects the Klan, and this makes it clear. They came through and they opened fire. They opened fire on us.
Violence occurs. It's like dropping a rock into a pond, and that pond continues to be roiled even after the rock hits the bottom. You know, that violent event in 1979 lasted for 8-10 minutes maybe, but that violence lived on in that community and arguably continues to live on in that community. The 20th anniversary of the Greensboro shooting in 1999, a group of community organizers got together and they started talking about, you know, it's been 20 years. We need to do something in this community to move forward. It was at that time that they began to think about doing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Memory work is about building political coalitions. There were groups in that town who had not worked together, who came together for this purpose, and they were building a political context in which they could then start to address the underlying challenges that exist in Greensboro around violence, around the economy, around policing. And it's that political engagement that becomes important for us as we start to think about reconciliation commissions and we start to think about memory work. When the Truth Commission started, the Greensboro City Council voted along racial lines to openly oppose the Truth Commission. After the Truth Commission was ended and the Truth Commission released its report, the city of Greensboro and the city council voted to express official regret for the events that happened in 1979. Now, it's not quite the same as an apology, but it's a huge step forward in terms of thinking about that community and thinking about what went on in that community and a process of reconciliation. If you've ever experienced traumatic loss of somebody, that loss stays with you forever. And part of what is important about memorials is you allow space for people to grieve. In the years after the Truth Commission took place, they got them to put up a memorial to the Greensboro Massacre in that city. It represents moving a community forward and what memory work means for us as we engage in reconciliation and truth work. We are living in an era supposedly of fake news and where somehow the truth doesn't matter. What does it mean that community after community after community across the United States are turning to the truth as a political organizing strategy? That in itself says that this truth still matters and the truth has a place in terms of a broader political kind of context and discussion. That's the power of memory work.
After September 11th, there was almost no time at all before massive amounts of people were saying, we need to build something to mark this now.
There was a sense of this as a kind of unmitigated tragedy with victims and villains.
I don't think as a country we've figured out what the ultimate lessons of September 11th are. I think there's a good argument to say historically, geopolitically, it was pretty unique. The question that follows is, why is it unique? Is it unique because there's a sort of sacred history attached to it, a lesson that plays into ultimate notions of good and evil? When you make that description, my concern is the kind of claim or lesson that you're setting yourself up to carry away from the events.
It makes it, I think, very difficult to have any kind of conversation with any real level of complexity, because at the end of the day, once you make something sacred, you're making it something that can't be criticized, certainly, something that is this kind of icon or object.
When you designate something as a kind of sacred event that we can't raise certain questions about, it would be offensive to ask about certain notions of responsibility, about certain historical timelines, maybe political lessons, then you're setting yourself up not to carry certain lessons away.
There was a lot of talk at that moment about patriotism and the fact that if you were willing to open up these questions of what's the relationship of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East to this tragedy, that meant you were unpatriotic. I mean, that language was thrown around very casually.
Because the American spirit is still alive, you have awakened a sleeping giant. We have had enough. It may have been dormant for a while, dazed and confused, being held down by people who are trying to put a cap on American ingenuity and freedom.
Prior to 9/11, we did not really speak about the U.S. as a homeland. This idea that this was like a personal kind of targeting of the family, as opposed to these huge icons of U.S. capitalism. And I think that's persisted in terms of how we think about 9/11 as this moment of unique trauma, unparalleled in kind of world history.
people felt kind of trauma viscerally through the camera lens. And in terms of official efforts at commemoration ever since, they've been wrapped up with a kind of media savvy. If you establish a monument or memorial to it in physical space, what does it symbolize? The history is incredibly complex. So where do you start the story and where do you end it and say what the lessons learned have been?
Of course, the memorial going to be seen for the first time this morning by the families. It is called Reflecting Absence. And Robin, it is striking.
The memorial to 9/11 in New York City in Lower Manhattan is a very moving space. You see the names, you see the water. At the same time, you're still surrounded by the city. And so I think it gives you a sense of how those massive structures dominated Lower Manhattan and how their absence continues to dominate Lower Manhattan, just in a different kind of way.
The architecture itself, they did some really beautiful things in terms of trying to not replace what had been there, but to integrate the event into the kind of ongoing landscape there and the architecture there.
It adopts a strategy of not trying to dictate what the lessons should be. It tries to provide people with the opportunities to reflect and find their own personal meaning in the event, to kind of meditate on the significance of something that defies easy explanation. It's a very good faith effort to avoid being too didactic about any one sacred meaning associated with September 11th.
On one hand, that space should be sacred, and it should be sacred to every single family member who lost someone in that tragedy. We should be ever mindful of what that space means for those people and what it means to live through trauma. But that's different than using 9/11 as a cover to stifle debate about things that should be debated.
And the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
There are all these kinds of moments that I think contributed to this idea that it was a pretty simple story to tell. And if you wanted to tell any other kind of story, well, why would these people have flown planes into, why this attack? Who's Osama bin Laden? How does this link to, foreign policy? I think all of those questions were very easily overridden, certainly in the early days of 9/11.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
We can be intelligently of two minds at once. We could recognize the kind of sacredness of that patch of ground, of the event in terms of the sheer loss of life and how best to honor that loss of life. But we can also be civically responsible and critical citizens and think then how different groups, leaders, and institutions try to use that memory.
We cannot allow ourselves to slip back into our pre-9/11 ignorance, or we are going to be doomed to let history repeat itself over and over.
George W. Bush will never seek a permission slip to defend the American people.
He said he'd do it, and he did.
Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
There's just something that is really quite despicable about using a tragedy to press forward one's own political ambitions. I think there is a way in which there's a lack of accountability that can happen when you have this sort of blanket remembering along a very kind of shallow stream.
Part of memory is the process of thinking critically as a citizen and recognizing that, yes, memory is always being shaped and used towards some end, but the question is towards what kind of social, political, and moral results.
I don't want this to happen again, and I want to figure out why it happened and how we could avoid having it happen. That might, in some ways, be seen as the greatest tribute to them.
We shouldn't fall into the trap of having 9/11 be something where it causes us to not question our place in society and the place of others in society and our place in the world.
People in the U.S. have a very conflicted and almost hostile relationship to the past.
It was Faulkner who said, particularly about the U.S. South, that the past is not dead. The past isn't even the past yet.
Questions around the nation's history are often reduced to a for or against.
Memorials arise at a particular kind of political time, a particular kind of political context. There were two huge periods when a lot of Confederate memorials went up in the United States. The first was at the turn from the 19th to the 20th century, and the second part of that was in the 1950s at the height of the civil rights struggle. And so if you think about that time period from 1890 to 1910, that was a time of an ascendant white supremacy, particularly in the American South, where you get segregation laws passed throughout the southern states.
Confederate monuments were used as a tactic of racial terror, saying that your life, your history will never be the kind of central history in this town.
And so those memorials reflect that time period. In a similar kind of way in the 1950s and 1960s, you again get this reinscription of Confederate memorials across the landscape.
Monuments to General Lee were about a message to Black Southerners about what their prospects were for having a good life.
In the 21st century, we have to ask the question, what is the place of those memorials on American public squares and courthouse squares? And how is it a reflection of dominant narratives of racism that no longer have place in this country? If you go to Gettysburg or you go to Chancellorsville or some of these other major Civil War battles, those memorials and those monuments have a particular kind of historical context, but that's different than in the public spaces and public places of the nation. You cannot go to a city or a town in the American South and not find some kind of memorial to the Confederacy.
A great many people put forth the argument that they are reflective of our history. And so it's a two-sided coin. Yes, removing Confederate statues could perhaps prompt some kind of forgetting, but by leaving them there, you're also prompting certain kinds of recall. And you have to decide which one is more important.
The monument that vexes me the most is a Confederate monument that is in Arlington National Cemetery. And it is the highest monument in the entire cemetery, and it's for the Confederacy. On that monument are two bas-reliefs that suggest faithful slaves were in the Confederacy. There's one that shows a figure of a black man. It's mostly a face and a kepi, which suggests that African Americans fought as soldiers with the Confederate side, which is totally wrong. There's also a bas-relief of a mammy figure who is taking care of the white child so that the white soldier, can go off to war. I'm really troubled by that monument. Arlington is a sacred place. And to have a monument there, the largest monument in Arlington, that dedicates itself to perpetuating the notion of faithful slaves, I also find troubling. But it's also something that is way in the back of the cemetery that nobody goes to. And I don't know, can you tear that thing down? I don't know. I do think that you should contextualize it, put up some kind of plaque or statement that would be there alongside it. I have a split personality. As an academic historian and a scholar, there's a piece of me that really says, please don't just tear them all down. They have value in terms of education, showing the complicated past and the struggles that we have been through. I really wish we could take statues and preserve them in monument graveyards. I suspect we won't, though, because of the money involved and because of what you would have to do to get that to happen. So I just fear that these statues will disappear someday without proper cataloging. That said, that's the academic in me. I still can understand why people would find them offensive and would want to take them down.
Forgetting comes from root words that basically mean to let go of something that you're holding in your hand. Doesn't mean to destroy it or declare amnesty. It's a choice to let your grasp on something go. We're not going to literally destroy any record of it or just snap our fingers and have amnesia about it.
So the idea is not to forget, it's rather to remember in a particular context, and let's not stay mired in the past, but let's see how the past has influenced the present.
If we go back to the Soviet Union as a comparative case, the former 15 republics of the Soviet Union, all of which were laced with monuments, you can compare how different regions of the former Soviet Union then assess those kinds of figures and the values and the political visions that they held out. In some parts of the former Soviet Union, those monuments remain in place. And they remain in place because there's a nostalgic longing for many aspects of life in the Soviet Union. In other areas, it was precisely those monuments that became the focal point of anger over the Soviet system. Those monuments to Lenin and to others were desecrated in the period leading up to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. I think a great many Americans applaud the efforts to remove Soviet and Marxist heroes and think that's a good thing. But in the same breath, one does have to think, why is it that racism is so pervasive in the United States quite some time after slavery has been abandoned? What is it that keeps racism so alive? Arguably, one could say that Confederate-era monuments, by recalling a certain way of life, that's one way in which a glorification of that period of history remains.
The value of a conversation about letting certain parts of the past go is something that we still need to have. And I think it's framed as kind of one side winning and one side losing. In other words, if the Confederate statues stay up, Confederate heritage movement wins. If a Confederate statue comes down, they've lost, and another sort of progressive group has won. So unfortunately, it's pitched as a kind of conflict over symbolism. How can we be in this process together? What kind of new history are we building, as opposed to just repeating the conflicts of old?
Thinking about the ways in which the history that we tell and the kind of fights over what should be included and what shouldn't be really do have an incredible impact on what people take away, what they want to think about, the history that it came out of, why it was created in the first place, what were the causes of the Civil War, like all of that kind of conversation.
In the context of the Confederate memorials, particularly the ones that were put up at the turn of the century around questions of white supremacy, those memorials don't really have a particular kind of historic context like they did when they were put up. The place of those monuments after Charlottesville, for example, what does it mean that white supremacists, the alt-right, and Nazis in America would rally around a statue to Robert E. Lee? And has that statue lived out its purpose? And does it have a particular kind of context in 21st century America that potentially we as a nation don't want to engage in, don't want to celebrate anymore, or don't want to be part and parcel of what we talk about when we talk about the American experience?